Welcome to the Tech in Shanghai podcast, the Pearl of the Orient. Shanghai is the city of the future. All systems go, full steam ahead. It never stops. Technology, innovation, ambition. It's everywhere. Join us as we explore this new world and talk to the people making it happen. The Tech in Shanghai podcast. The future is now.
Everybody, welcome back. This is episode 2 of the Tech in Shanghai podcast, the show dedicated to bringing you the people of the Shanghai startup scene. Our intention is to give a little bit of insight about what's going on here on the ground in one of the most dynamic places in the world in the technology and startup scene. I'm your host, John Vallis. Last week we had Alex Duncan from KWO with some really interesting stories about what's going on in the social media market here and how they onboard clients from foreign companies and help them break through into the social media market here. So if you'd like to hear more about what KWO is doing here, you can certainly check out episode 1. But today we have Liam Winston here with us of MobileNow Group. MobileNow is a full-service mobile development company.
That's right, yeah.
So, Liam, thanks for coming on the show.
You're most welcome.
It's a lovely Shanghai day here today. No pollution, really hot, really sunny. So, great day to be in a studio.
Exactly.
So, Liam, I've done a little research on MobileNow Group, but I'm never the best one to give a description of kind of what you guys do. So why don't you let us know what you do, who you do it for, and the status of the company?
Sure. I guess we still consider ourselves a startup, even though we've been up and running for nearly 5 years now. Mm-hmm. We set up here in Shanghai in 2009, and we focus purely on the mobile space. So anything that's really got a mobile focus, that's our area. We don't necessarily do too much web. We don't do too much social. It's really a straight mobile play. So typically, clients engage us to create custom or bespoke apps, as well as responsive websites, and increasingly WeChat mobile deployments as well. So we've probably, in our 5 years, probably deployed about nearly 50 projects now across the board, for a combination of multinationals, local entities as well, covering all aspects of mobile. Cool. We have a team of nearly 30 people, with our main office here in Shanghai and a second office in Changsha and Hunan. Mm-hmm. And we also keep an office down in Singapore as well.
Right. Now, I meant to ask you about that. I noticed on your website you do have an office in Changsha and Singapore. Yeah. Singapore is a bit more understandable, but for people that aren't familiar with China, Changsha is what we'd call a second-tier city.
Yes.
So I wanted to ask you, before we got going, why is it that MobileNow is in Changsha?
Okay. I mean, we sometimes do get asked that question. So I agree, it's maybe not the most usual place for a startup to set up. But in essence, I guess we saw a couple of things. Firstly, Changsha has a very good access to great universities. So from a talent perspective, it's very good down there. Secondly, I think we were looking to maybe hedge our bets a little bit and not have everything kind of placed in Shanghai. Obviously, there's to some extent increased costs in terms of having everything in Shanghai, particularly as it increases. Not saying that Changsha is cheap, but it gives us an alternative. We tend to get pretty good loyalty from the guys down there, which I think is maybe less evident in an international city like Shanghai. So those would probably be the two reasons why we invested in there in the first place. And to date, it's been working very well for us.
Right. And do you personally have to go to Changsha quite a bit?
I am due to go in the next couple of months. It's normally my partner Thomas that tends to go down there more often. And it's interesting to kind of, I guess, to get out a little bit out of your comfort zone from the international city that is Shanghai, right, down to somewhere a little less developed, but with huge potential.
Right. I mean, I've never been to Changsha myself, but I've been to a lot of second-tier cities here in China. And I mean, of course, the story is the same almost everywhere. Just massive projects everywhere, building, very nice infrastructure and amenities, but still lacking kind of that international cosmopolitan touch that maybe Shanghai exclusively has a hold on.
No, for sure. I mean, I think that's a very fair assessment. I think my colleague tells me there's maybe less than 100 Laowais down there, and they all tend to congregate in one particular bar on a Friday evening, and pretty much everyone knows everyone, which you certainly couldn't say for a place like Shanghai. But equally, that's also quite refreshing as well,
right?
To kind of get away and see another side of things.
Right. Yeah, I lived in Dalian for a while, and So similar thing there. Where it wears after a little while, seeing the same faces at the same places, but certainly nice to change it up. Now, Liam, I noticed on the website as well that you guys were established in 090909.
Yes.
Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Coincidentally, the day before I arrived in China. And I also noticed there that you have, for the things that you've developed for your clients, apps and mobile services, you've got 5 million downloads. Is that
cumulative? So I think we've undertaken we undertake, I guess, two types of projects. The majority of what we do is commissioned work. So that would be where a corporate comes to us and say, we need some assistance with a mobile solution, and we would help them implement an app or a responsive site or WeChat, something like that. Additionally, we've also undertaken a few of our own projects. We refer to them more as IP initiatives, so they're really kind of something we do ourselves. So we've created a few games in that space, games that have become number one games in China. One which was Super Ball Escape. We've also created more of utility apps. One called Data Tie, which was like a photo booth app, which has had like 2 million plus downloads, which is reasonably good.
Sure.
I guess numbers always seem to get not inflated, but they seem to. If you tell that to someone in the West, they go 2 million downloads. Like, wow. But I guess you get a bit more grounded in China, where 2 million downloads is significant, but it's not super huge.
Right. Now, is that? I mean, I'm curious. Is that because not only the size of the market, but is the Chinese social media and game market more fickle than in the West? I mean, is it very transient, or?
There's definitely idiosyncrasies that are pertinent to the Chinese market that we don't see in the West. For example, I guess there's less of a tendency for Chinese mobile users to want to pay for content, which is we're not complaining. That's just the way it is. So I think you tend to have to build your strategies that way to take that in mind. But as the Chinese mobile market becomes in essence the biggest market in the world, I think there's less of a focus in terms of looking to the West to see what's happening, because it's all happening here. And we know you obviously see that in very, very, very many aspects of Chinese way of doing things, whether it's e-commerce, whether it's mobile, everything like that. It's now all happening here. And I think it's very much increasingly that the West will look to the East to look for initiatives and trends as well.
Right. So is that part of the reason, or the full reason why MobileNow is here in China, because you want to take advantage of the Chinese market and design things for the Chinese market?
That's a very good question. I guess we set up here initially in that my partner Thomas was working in Beijing at the time and had recently moved to Shanghai. I'd also spent a fair bit of time in China previously, so China just seemed like the natural place to set up. Right. It was also at the same time when iPhone had just come out, so it was part of, I guess, the way the market was evolving away from I guess the early smartphones, which are primarily Nokia based. I mean, Thomas very much saw the advent of the iPhone landing as, just a revolutionary opportunity in terms of what was happening in the mobile space. And I think he's been quite rightly borne out in that. So that was a real basis for being here in China. In terms of how it's evolved and how we saw the market, we did initially think that we were doing a lot of offshore work, bringing it into China. So, projects from North America, projects from Europe coming in. And yes, we do a reasonable amount of those projects. But I think the thing that's really surprises the most is the amount of domestic work we've done here in China. That's really, really exceeded our expectations. Now, I think the reasons for that are a couple of fold. I think China as a market is very, very aggressive to embrace new technology, and mobile always comes to the fore there. I think also given the amount of media budgets we see here in China, the amount that's required maybe for doing production for a mobile platform isn't so much as maybe you see in a less developed or a less mass market. So those are probably a couple of reasons why we see mobile been really, really pushed here domestically. Right.
I mean, it's very interesting to observe the state of the mobile market in China. I mean, it seems like every other day you're reading a headline, whether it's about how many people have smartphones or how much they're engaging in them, how much time is spent on them. I mean, every metric in the market seems to be world leading, and you read them on a constant basis. Now, you mentioned that MobileNow works with outside clients, but also you have your own in-house development arm.
Yes,
and you put out apps through that.
Yes, I mean, I mean, we develop everything ourselves in house. Whether it's iOS development, Android development, HTML5 development, covering responsive and also WeChat. I'd probably say the amount of commissioned work in terms of with external clients is probably 80 or 90%. And then probably some of our own initiatives we cover off maybe 10, 15%.
Right.
It's one of those classic cliches for I guess for a startup. If there's someone willing to pay for your work, you tend to do more of that, even though you'd really probably want to do more of your own initiatives.
Sure.
So I think when we first started up, we were doing a lot more of our own initiative work, but that does tend to burn down your startup capital pretty quickly.
Right.
So you end up kind of having to do the maths on that and getting the balance between the two. So I think we've got to a point now where we've got a reasonably comfortable equilibrium. We do also do a fair amount of work with entrepreneurs. So sometimes we'll partner with them from a equity setup, and I guess that keeps us pretty much in the entrepreneurial game, as well as in maybe the more straightforward commissioned work.
Right. Now, we were talking about the mobile Chinese market a second ago. One of the amazing things about China is that there's such a mobile dense market, because a lot of the consumers in this market didn't have access to PCs and desktop, not even, not so many years ago. And kind of just when they were entering the market, smartphones were available, and they've really, taken them on vigorously.
Yeah.
Is that why you guys decided to focus primarily on mobile, because you were in the China market specifically, or was it your area of expertise, or?
I think the leapfrog effect that you talk of is, it's so borne out here in China, and we obviously see that in a few other markets, but maybe not as aggressively. I think India, for example, sees the same sort of thing, where people's first web experiences via their mobile devices, and that's very, very true here in China. I think the reason for the focus for us in China was more because we were already here, and we saw it both as a potential for a domestic market, and also for to have as a base for Asia. I think it may be maybe 10, 15 years ago, particularly when maybe I first moved to Asia myself, the classic hubs for anyone to set up were either Hong Kong or Singapore.
Right.
I'm not saying those days are gone, but I think for any startup really wanting to come to Asia now, to me, Delhi and Shanghai is pretty much where it's happening. Right. Depending on where your focus is here. I think Hong Kong and Singapore provide a relatively easy foot in, but in terms of wanting to be where the action is, it makes sense to either be in the heart of it here in China or in the heart of it in India. Right,
and that's actually one of the things I wanted to ask you about. The economic centers and the future economic centers of Asia are certainly the ones you just mentioned, Shanghai being top among them. But many people are familiar with the obstacles too, as you said, setting up in mainland China versus Hong Kong versus Singapore versus Tokyo versus other centers. So can you give us a little insight, speak to the challenges that are present here that perhaps wouldn't be in Hong Kong, and I guess a little more on why you endure them?
It's quite interesting. When I moved to Hong Kong initially in 1993, and I was actually working for a publishing company, and one of their first big successes was a publication or a book called The Life and Death of a Joint Venture in China. And in those days, in the early 90s, that was the only way you could really set up in China. It had to be a JV. You had to have that partnership. I think through the progression of the WOFE setup in terms of wholly owned foreign enterprise, that's definitely made setup in China a little bit easier. Not saying it's as easy as Singapore. Like, for example, in Singapore, you can, in essence, probably set up a company within a day or two, most of the work done online. So when we set up our WOFE here, a lot of paperwork, but in essence, it's something you have to do. And I think it impacts your cycle in terms of how quickly up and running you can get. So you could go to Hong Kong, get set up in a couple of months, get the lie of the land in Hong Kong, probably then work out all the actions north of the border, then progress north of the border. Or you could take the deeper plunge, jump into China, have all the hassle and the bureaucracy, or the relative hassle and the bureaucracy, but get to the action a little bit quicker. Right. So I think it kind of depends, I guess, on the individuals involved or the company itself, and how maybe aggressive they want to be to kind of get to the action, so to speak.
Right. Now, another aspect of setting up in Shanghai and in China, previously, a lot of foreign companies set up in China, whether it be manufacturing or services or technology, because it was so cost effective. But over the last 5 years, especially, we've seen that rapidly evaporate. So how has that affected your company? You set up here in 2009. Since that time, costs have risen dramatically in rent and in minimum wage or wages in general. So how has that, put pressure, if any, on MobileNow?
I think you're absolutely right in terms of particularly the tier one cities are no longer the cost effective opportunities they were maybe 8-10 years ago. Fortunately, they probably haven't reached the same sort of cost parameters as a Hong Kong or a Singapore. So still reasonably okay. I mean, it's challenging. I mean, typically when we're conducting reviews with our employees, most people are asking for a fairly healthy increase, not the sort of thing that might be tolerated certainly in the West.
Right.
So I think that has to be factored in terms of how you price your product, and I guess you need to get a balance between, I think, managing your cost of your talent and your resource versus what's viable for a client to pay. Mm-hmm. So it's really just balancing those two.
Now, is that, I mean, basically what you're saying is, can you pass on the cost of that to your customers via the service you provide? And are the majority of your customers outside of China or multinationals that may have a presence in China but are based outside of China?
To some extent, we can pass those costs on in terms of our client setup. Most of our clients would be China-based. Now, there may well be a multinational based here in China, or there may be a local entity. So, yeah, we have a combination between international and local entities based here in China.
Mm-hmm. Okay. One of the things, just to backtrack a bit, I wanted to ask you a bit earlier, but we kind of went through it. You mentioned that MobileNow does apps and games.
Yes.
So for people that are kind of in that space and in that industry, can you give a little insight as to, what factors you assess to make a decision to go with an app or a game? Is it purely you have inspiration and an idea and you run with it and you think it'll be successful in the market? Are there ways that you test the different ideas? And a little more broadly, the app market, the business app, the utilitarian market versus the gaming market in terms of how you can monetize them, in terms of the downloads. Can you shed a little light on that? Sure.
I mean, I'll probably give it to you from maybe two angles. One would be from a commissioned work perspective. This would be like, for example, a multinational approaching us and deciding they want to do something from a mobile perspective. Now, it really would depend on what their objectives were in terms of what they wanted to achieve. That would give a good idea in terms of what would be the most pertinent solution to put in place. So, generally, if it's straight information that's been looking to be passed on to a client, then a utility app makes the most sense. If it's maybe looking at a deeper engagement, so maybe looking to assist with brand awareness, then considering a game, it would make a lot of sense. We probably about a year ago, we did a project for Zespri, which is the holding company that sits behind Kiwifruit. So Kiwifruit were relatively new to China, and they really wanted to raise brand awareness. So the goal there was their target audience is young mothers, and we know from the data that the most common thing that young mothers do on the phone is play games, and they really like the kind of casual games. So for Zespri, we decided to embark upon a game, a vertical farming game, which was really about allowing young mothers to understand what Zespri was, that it was what a kiwi fruit is, fruit is, which is quite relatively new to the China market, but also to demonstrate the nutritional benefits of that, so that the next time they're maybe down the supermarket, they give consideration to purchasing a kiwi fruit. So that's, I guess, the softer sell, not so direct, but in that scenario, a game can be perfect for that. Whereas if it's say maybe a shopping mall destination, then clearly it probably lends itself more towards the utility app, where it's like, these are all our stores within our shopping destination. This is the types of product they sell, and it's more informational. So right. I guess it's informational functional versus kind of branding, and maybe awareness and a soft sell would decide which way you would go.
Right. Okay. And in general, the two different markets in terms of monetization, specifically within China, what are the similarities or differences between the two?
I guess it's a little bit different for when brands are entering a space, because they're not necessarily driven by a monetization opportunity. They're primarily being driven by awareness. Mm-hmm. So for them, it's making sure enough of their customers or potential customers are downloading the game, been engaged on the game, and they're not so worried about having to monetize or having to repay their investment on the game, because it's really a brand initiative.
I see.
I think when you look at a pure dedicated gaming perspective, it's a much more complex and challenging route to market. I mean, we've obviously done that for a few of our games. A couple of our games have got very high in the App Store, so there's definitely dynamics around that. I mean, one typical one, for example, is that the growth period and the opportunity to really accelerate and snowball is very, very finite. In fact, very short. Mm-hmm. So it's very important that marketing efforts are focused on the first couple of days, so that the number of downloads can start to progress. So you get visibility in the app stores. You start to then get organic growth. If it's very much a kind of slow, gradual push, then you're going to miss the opportunity.
Right. And MobileNow is end to end, right? You develop the product, you promote it, you provide analytics or feedback. I presume.
I mean, we do everything apart from buy media,
right?
Because I guess we focus primarily in the mobile space. Mm-hmm. The media buying entities or media buying agencies are a better place to do that. Right. Often we will advise them in terms of what would be the most opportune channels to consider. Mm-hmm. But yeah, we do end to end, from upfront consultancy through to development, through to optimization, analytics, review, etc.
Right. And I'm just wondering, within China, what, when you all the development work is done, how do you promote your products for your clients in China through the whether they be social media, national media, whatever channels exist? How do you do that?
It's a very good question, and something that we do have to spend a fair amount of time advising our clients to focus upon. Because sometimes, I guess from the initial discussions, it's very much okay, we need to launch this mobile platform, and it's all about the mobile platform, which there does need to be that amount of focus on it. However, there also needs to be almost an equal amount of focus on the actual launch of the product itself. When we use the adage, you could have the most fantastic app in the world, but if no one knows about it, no one downloads it.
Sure, yeah.
So the marketing or the promotion of an app or a service or whatever it is very important. And from that perspective, I guess it's similar to many other platforms. You're looking at three particular channels to utilize in terms of your own media, in terms of your own social channels. Mm-hmm. Plus, if it's feasible, paid media. I mean, paid media can work very well. Mm-hmm. And going back to the Zespri case that I referenced earlier, that was an important aspect to it. Mm-hmm. However, as a fairly big brand, having your own social networks, having your own web channels, you can do a lot from that. So there doesn't necessarily need to be a financial commitment in terms of paid media, but you do need to work your channels very well together to create that impetus to drive downloads.
Right. And what's MobileNow's interaction and usage of social media specifically in China? Because it's such a hot topic right now. There's so much buzz around social media. Yeah. And of course, recent events in the US with Alibaba and JD has just brought more attention to everything that's going on in the tech industry and mobile industry in China. So how do you guys interact with Chinese social media? Because to me, it seems like such a quickly shifting market. Things get developed, iterated, and launched so quickly. Yeah. They get adopted so quickly, but they could also get left and move on to the next one so quickly. So how do you guys, first of all, approach the Chinese social media market? Yeah. How do you make your decisions, and how do you deal with that change that goes on in it?
I guess our interaction with social is from two perspectives. Firstly, and going back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of promotional activity, it's very important to obviously leverage channels there, and they're obviously specific Chinese channels. From that perspective, it's really a matter of working with the client and maybe going through the identification of key opinion leaders that will have a lot of influence on a particular channel, and maybe reaching out to them by way of influencing their influencers. So that's probably a typical way to work that most brands would interact with it. Mm-hmm. Probably the more interesting side of social for us is where social has become a mobile platform. So I guess back in the day when brands were going mobile, the only real way to go mobile was creation of an app. Increasingly, the second option that's come to the fore has been the creation of a responsive website, another viable way to mobilize your platform. Now, the third one that's really much come to the fore in the last probably 6 months is enhanced SNS, which in essence is looking at ways that one can build out of, say, the WeChat platform. Mm-hmm. So WeChat in essence, through the way it's been opened up by Tencent, in essence almost allows you to create a microsite within the WeChat platform. So that's making it a very powerful tool, a very powerful destination that brands can now engage with their consumers via the WeChat channel. So we have increasingly, particularly in 2014, been doing a lot more work in the WeChat space as we've built out particular functionality within that WeChat space. I totally agree that, sometimes only certain platforms are flavor of the month, and you never know, in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months time, what's going to come down the line. Mm-hmm. I mean, we've seen Weibo kind of come up and now tail off. We've seen WeChat kind of almost take over its mantle. We don't know what's around the corner just yet. Right. So I think for our brands was very much advising them to make the most of what's available at that particular time, but also to be aware of what potentially is coming up and coming to the fore. Exactly.
Right. It just as an aside, it seems, I can get your take on this. It seems in the Western tech and mobile markets, there's specific, very, very specific solutions. And perhaps that's because founders and entrepreneurs have always been advised so adamantly to focus on a single problem and solve that problem. Yes. And as a result, you have a lot of different services and different products,
yes, but
they're all by different companies.
Yes.
And what seems very interesting in the Chinese mobile and tech market, especially in relation to WeChat, which is surging in popularity and quickly becoming the de facto social media avenue in China, is that it offers seemingly everything. Mm-hmm. It does voice messaging, it does profiles, it does payments, it does, so many different things that, from my perspective in the West, we might see all being done by different companies. Yeah. Do you think that's because WeChat was launched and had such a huge force and financial capacity and intellectual capacity behind it in being a Tencent property versus being a startup from a couple kids in a basement or garage?
No, it's very interesting. I mean, sometimes you can almost look at the way that functionality has been created on platforms here in China and kind of think this is some sort of mismatch of eBay and a number of different other things. But I think probably the probably fairer way to look at it is that a lot of the platforms here in Tencent in particular, they've looked at maybe what's the best bits of this, what's the best bits of that. Mm-hmm. Let's bring them all together and put them on a single platform. Right. And I think also to your point, as they've gained more and more momentum, as they've got critical mass, as they've got 300, 400, 500 million users, they've kind of thought, why don't we add this on? Why don't we add that on? It's a natural evolution, and I think it's very much just indicating that the West should really be looking east and vice versa these days.
Right. I mean, it's such a funny change in dynamic because, of course, China's approach, during the early phase of their development, as is the case in many developing countries, is take what works elsewhere, make it your own, and produce in that way. And like you just mentioned, perhaps that was the initial approach behind a lot of these social media outlets in China, especially when, many social media platforms from the West have been blocked. So it's, they've basically been a ripe market, and all they had to really do was copy some functionality. But now, as you mentioned, what it seems is they're really innovating. They're bringing many different functions together and wrapping them up under one roof, essentially, and providing apps and services that really, by comparison, are in some cases superior to their Western counterparts, and certainly seem to have a lot of momentum behind them.
Now, I think what we're also starting to see is that the entities here in China have got something very powerful to work for the China market. Now they're looking, beyond these shores in terms of ways of growing that. So we start to see kind of WeChat probably gaining a lot more momentum in Southeast Asia. Still, if I talk to people in Europe and stuff like that, they probably really haven't got much of an idea of what it is. They're still sitting on WhatsApp. But yeah, very much, I think, dominated growing in China, now pushing eastwards and westwards in any which way. Maybe not that dissimilar from handset manufacturer Xiaomi in terms of done a fantastic job here in China.
Right.
Now they're looking to pretty much push into a lot of Southeast Asia, into Europe, because they just have such a compelling proposition.
Right. I mean, it's just such an amazing story. The reason why we have a podcast like this, because it doesn't really matter your industry. China is so there's so much energy, so much capital, so many people behind doing so many different things that they want to get involved. It's such a competitive market domestically. It means all the best rise to the top. And what we're seeing now, I think, is what you were just saying, is they're kind of now getting to the point where they can compete on the global market.
Exactly.
And it's very exciting times. I mean, I know for myself, I'm an avid promoter of WeChat with my friends back home. of course, because I don't access Twitter much here and things like that, so I have to use the Chinese social media platforms, but also because, I find it very useful, very functional. So
sure.
I implore them to get on, and once they do, they're like, "Wow, I've never where did this come from? This is amazing." It's like, that's kind of some of the things China's doing. So very interesting. Before we get on to a few Shanghai-related things, you mentioned with the Zespri example, the client you work with, you mentioned that you developed a game for them to basically engage and create some awareness with their target market, which was housewives,
young mothers
and stuff. Which is for people that don't know, is a huge part of pretty much all product launches and product developments and market entrance here in China is educating and generating awareness with the consumer. Now, of course, that's true everywhere, but especially in China, if you walk into a grocery store, you walk into a retail location, education is a huge part of the retail experience here, whether it's online or offline. Reason being, of course, is again, the Chinese consumer market hasn't, for a long time did not have access to a lot of the goods and services that they are now gaining access to. As a result, unlike us in the West, we grew up with certain products and services and companies and brands. We don't need to be educated about them. Here, a huge portion of the demographic in the market did not have experience with a lot of these brands prior. So education is a huge part of that. I'm wondering for MobileNow, in terms of the clients that approach you to work with you guys, how much of the clients you work, how many of the clients that you work with have that intention? That's why they want to work with you guys.
I think there's definitely a few examples of how we worked in that space. For example, we worked with Chinese wine connoisseur Chantal Shi, and what she was aiming to do was to, I guess recognizing, I think China's now become the 6th biggest wine consumer market in the world, or some pretty impressive statistic like that. But we basically worked with her on a wine appreciation app, which is very much looking to focus on the Chinese wine consumer and help them to better understand, I guess, the culture and the background of the French vineyards, something that she's very well versed upon. So it was doing everything from having a pronunciation guide in terms of how you should pronounce a particular chateau, to now you need to make meeting or tasting notes on a particular vintage. But really looking at educating the Chinese wine consumer as I guess wine becomes more and more influential within the marketplace. Right. People want to know a bit more about it. So education is absolutely key.
Right.
One other example we also is very close to that is we also work with Greenpeace, and this was to create we called it edutainment. So it's kind of a fun way of educating people, but it's basically to make consumers aware of the not the risk, but more almost the existence of genetically modified foods. So basically, we created a little game where they fed a monster a particular food or a particular brand, whether it's a Nestle, whether it was a beer or something like that. And depending on how the monster reacted, he was denoted whether it was GM modified or not. So instantly, the consumer then started to have an appreciation of 400 different brands, which were genetically modified and which weren't. So when they then next went to the supermarket, they could make a qualified choice about whether they wanted to buy GM or not.
Interesting.
So yeah.
Interesting. Now, one thing before we go on, in China, censorship is obviously an issue for some types of businesses more than others. What's been MobileNow's experience with censorship? Have you had to confront it? In what ways have you dealt with that issue?
Ironically, I'd probably say the toughest encounters we've had for censorship, and I use that in a very broad term, have been maybe with Apple rather than with Chinese entities.
Really?
Because obviously, for any app that needs to go through approval, it has to be vetted by Apple to make sure it's okay. And sometimes we've had to make minor tweaks from that. That's more from a technical perspective than a content perspective.
Right.
But no, we haven't really run into any particular challenges from a bureaucracy and an approval perspective here in China. But then I also think we're probably not doing anything that would tend to be maybe in the risk zone from that perspective as well.
Right. Yeah. That's kind of the impression I got from from my understanding of what MobileNow does. But I had to ask because being in the social space and development space and mobile space in China, typically people will encounter at least some form of it. So let's move on a bit now to a little more fun conversation regarding Shanghai. Not that, of course, MobileNow is not interesting, but everyone has their Shanghai stories. It's a very interesting city to live in, especially at this point in time in its history. I mean, as we've been discussing throughout this show, there's so much going on. I mean, when I go home, people ask me, why I live here, and occasionally I scratch my head. Of course, we all have those China days, but if I'm being honest, my answer is generally the energy. And when I say that, I mean there's just so much going on. And it doesn't matter what your industry is there's capital, there's people, there's education, there's energy behind everything, and that means that you live in a very vibrant environment where things are kicking off all the time. You're never short of things to do, and it's especially by Chinese standards and even global standards, it's a fairly convenient city. The metro is great, the road system is great, and it just seems like it's got that charm about it that all the economic and financial and ambition related reasons why many foreigners come here, coupled with just it's got that essence, that character, that old colonial kind of vibe that makes it a very interesting time right now for me. What are your thoughts on it?
No, I'd agree with you wholeheartedly from an energy perspective, and I'm maybe probably showing my age here a little bit, but I think the kind of the scene or the energy that you see now in Shanghai is very reminiscent of Hong Kong in the kind of early to mid 90s. That was probably the first place I lived in Asia, and there was definitely a buzz that I was quite shocked at as soon as I landed there from Europe. I think Shanghai maintains that. It maintains that cosmopolitan nature. There's definitely energy. I mean, I spend a fair bit of my time in Singapore, and I see that pretty much every time I come back up here to Shanghai. There is that buzz, whichever aspects of Shanghai life you look upon.
Right. And what's the difference between Shanghai and Singapore? I mean, just for interested listeners.
I mean, Singapore is often viewed as being easy Asia, and it certainly is that. You can get into a taxi, not need to use your bad Mandarin to get around. You can be pretty sure you'll get to a particular place at a particular time. But I guess easy is often synonymous with maybe a little bit boring. Maybe that's a bit harsh on Singapore. It's definitely reinvented itself in the last kind of 5 to 7 years. But it's I guess there are opposites from China.
Right.
Maybe easier lifestyle, easier to get around, not so much energy, maybe not so much buzz. Pollution's a little bit better.
I've heard it's a little less laissez-faire than Shanghai. There's fairly strict restrictions on certain behavior. We've all heard the chewing gum example, and all that kind of stuff.
I mean, that's kind of weird. I think it's people's probably first take on Singapore's no chewing gum or no crossing roads or jaywalking, but
right.
It's not as bad as one might think. Definitely, right. It's definitely definitely loosened itself a little bit in the last few years.
When did you arrive in Shanghai? What year?
I first came to Shanghai probably as a tourist in 95.
Okay,
and then I've probably been coming here professionally since the early 2000s.
Wow, I mean, it's too broad of a question for me to ask what's changed, but can you give us, can you highlight a couple things that in your mind have really dramatically changed? Maybe some for the good, some for the worse.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think when coming here first time, that was when China really hadn't opened up that much at all. I keep meaning to dig out some old photos from those days and try to match that back against places now. So it's, in those days there wasn't really so much cafes or anything like that to go to. If you wanted Western food, you pretty much had to go to a KFC or something like that.
Right.
So that's changed, I guess, as China has opened up, which I think is generally a good thing in terms of having made things a lot more cosmopolitan. Mm-hmm. Definitely easier to get around. I remember kind of having to go to train stations at a certain time on a certain day to a certain platform for a ticket at a certain place. And if you weren't there, it was kind of May or come back tomorrow. Mm-hmm. So that there's definitely an ease of kind of getting around. So I think in general things have probably improved. I guess the only downside I think is the way that we pretty much look at the AQI index every day in terms of what we're going to do. That's probably the main downside.
And is there a big difference from 95, early 2000s to now in that regard?
I guess from a personal perspective, and again, maybe this is probably also talks about the advent of mobile. I didn't really even think about it in those days.
Right.
I'm not saying it was glorious blue skies every day, but you just didn't really. it didn't really hit the radar so much.
Right.
To me, I only really have a recollection of been starting to worry about haze. Probably, and this is more Beijing centric, and the run up to the Olympics. That's when probably haze or fog, as it was called in those days, came to the fore. And I think pretty much since then it's been on everyone's radar. And because we're now all mobilized, we pretty much look at it every day to see how things are.
Right. And do you do anything in particular to combat the effects? I mean, do you wear a mask? Do you do the air filters in the home? I mean, how do you push back that force?
I mean, I try not to go out and maybe exercise if it gets above a certain point. But I think to some extent, you kind of got to grin and bear it.
Right.
Otherwise, it can almost kind of totally take over your life.
Right.
It's not good. I'm sure in later years there may be repercussions, but it's kind of, what can you do?
It's hard to have a perspective to that far in. We were speaking with Alex from Cable about the same issue, and he rides his bike around everywhere. And he said two things. He said, first, I'm just so into what I'm doing. I'm so passionate about it. I'm so busy. I really don't have that much time to care about it. And secondly, I can't project 40 years to the future. They could be hit by a bus tomorrow, sort of thing. So it's hard to. I mean, it's one of those things that me personally, it's kind of a field of interests in natural health and wellness and things like that. So I try to do what I can in terms of diet and a few other methods of maybe cleaning out some of the accumulated damage. But I'm not one of these people that will walk around with a mask. It's just it's too much of a discomfort for me, and it looks kind of strange. So
I mean, I guess you get similar scenarios with the reused oil, and then washing fruit beforehand, and I think. I mean, you could go to all those preventative causes, but I think it would just overtake your life.
Right.
You'd be spending all your time washing things and, cleaning things and not eating here and not eating there. And I just think, as I said, you've almost got to just get on with it. Sadly.
Yeah, it's the price you pay to be here, unfortunately. But, I mean, on the bright side, as we were talking about with everything that China seems to take on, now they've admitted the problem, they've identified it, and they've committed. They've identified it and committed to a solution. So, if past examples are to be instructive, then there should be some fairly robust efforts on behalf of the Chinese government to actually remedy that problem. So
I think you're right. I mean, I think it's. I wouldn't say the government now has a lot of accountability, but I think increasingly they do need to think what the general public are considering about things. I think the gas deal with Putin last week. I mean, it was obviously a big statement, but I think if that comes to the fore, and we see a little less coal being burnt, and I think that can only be good.
Now, in terms of the startup and tech scene of which you are, of course, a part of. Since 2009, and we'll keep it there instead of going back to early 2000s when you first arrived. But since MobileNow has been launched and since you've been with them, how has what's the tech and startup scene here like? I mean, everyone hears about all the stories, all the funding, all the amazing Chinese social media or amazing Chinese technology and startups going on. A lot of really interesting foreign funded and foreign founded startups such as MobileNow and others. But it seems to have a less cohesive center than your Silicon Valleys and other places around the world. Can you tell us what it was like first setting up in 2009 and what kind of community, if any, exists?
I mean, I think I mean, drawing parallels with the West Coast, I think is fair, and definitely that infrastructure isn't here. And I'd also say it probably isn't in any other place in Asia as well. Singapore is often cited as being a big hub, and that's reasonably okay, but that doesn't have that same diligence or same kind of infrastructure that kind of helps with that. From our own perspective, I guess we didn't do too much funding rounds, so we didn't really have to seek a lot out of ourselves. A lot of the funding that came through initially was friends and family, which kind of got us to stage one. Thereafter, I guess we really looked to move to break even, so we weren't so reliant upon funding. I think there's definitely I think good funding opportunities here. I think a lot of the West Coast players have kind of kind of planted themselves here and on the lookout for different things. Even some of the banks like Shanghai Pudong Development Bank even has kind of investment kind of arms as well, which are looking out for those opportunities. So it's definitely here. It's maybe a little bit harder to look for, but there's sufficient events, there's sufficient network and opportunities where you can tap into that quite easily.
Right.
And I think as more and more, I guess, Chinese entities either IPO overseas or get noticed on the radar, then I think more and more focus will become upon China to find the next X, Y, Z.
Right. Now, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit now. For those people listening that are budding entrepreneurs or aspiring entrepreneurs that want to come to China and get involved in a startup, can you give us 3 pieces of advice for someone who's got a great idea, who's got the passion, who's got the motivation, everything, and they want to be in China, they want to be a part of the story here? What are 3 pieces of advice you could give them to help them on their way?
I think probably first and foremost, and it sounds really boring, but it's unfortunately one of the kind of key points in terms of making sure a startup works, is looking at your business case. So looking at the viability of your business case that actually has sense and can move forward. Now, whether that business case is reliant upon tapping into the Chinese domestic market or whether it's just using China as a base to then go globally isn't so important. It's really just a case of having done the maths upon that business case, worked out the plan, and kind of gone from there.
Right.
Because I think sometimes there's some fantastic ideas out there, but if it hasn't been kind of fleshed through, then it tends to maybe not be so viable. Secondly, I'd probably say try and get to market as quickly and nimbly as one can. I guess it's the classic, as we call it from a development perspective, the agile versus waterfall approach, in terms of, don't spend 6 months actually perfecting something, get something, workable out in 2 months, gauge the reaction from that, and then refine it there afterwards.
Right.
And I think that also helps from a funding perspective. I think probably thirdly, if the research has been done that China is the market to go into, then really need to embrace China. Kind of need to kind of get out, get involved, and live and breathe China to kind of get a feeling of what is going on.
Right. Okay. Now we're nearing the end of the show. Thank you so much for giving us the time today. I know you're incredibly busy.
No problem.
Just a few more fun, quick fire questions. So we all need to release some stress here in Shanghai at the end of a work week, or even on a beautiful Monday like it is today.
Yeah.
Excuse me. What's your favorite bar in Shanghai?
We're for better for worse, we're literally probably about 200 meters from Yongkanglu, so that makes it
which is a notorious bar street here in Shanghai.
Which it was also, I guess, maybe part of the attraction for moving to that area when we moved about 2 years ago. It's been a very good location.
Which interestingly wasn't a bar street 2 or 3 years ago, and now is. As so
so
many things.
We've kind
Shanghai.
of seen that grow over the past couple of years since we've been there. So there's no manner of bars down there that we can pop down to. We have quite a large French contingent within our organisation. So Café de Stagiaire is often the first point to call along there.
Okay.
It's quite weird being in Shanghai and almost going to a bar and potentially ordering in French. You can almost have that whole kind of French ecosystem,
right,
resolving within not France,
right?
Which I think is good. I think
it adds character to the city for sure. And there is a huge French population.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, what about favorite restaurant in the city?
I'd probably say there's Hunanese. There's a very good Hunanese just next to Dr. Beer on Dongguolu, whose name I just forget at the moment. But that's normally the first. Guyi. That's probably our first point of call for taking any visitors there, or even wanting to go ourselves. Sort of place you leave and your lips are still tingling, but the food is fantastic.
Okay, and what about weekends here? If you're trying not to go down to the bar, if you're trying to be healthy, stay fit. What's a way, in Shanghai, it's such a big city, you can sometimes feel trapped in it.
Yeah.
What are what's the thing you do on the weekend, if you have the time, if you can get away from the office to relax? What do you do?
Ironically, I'd probably have the same ailments as your previous podcast interview, Alex. And that's heading out on a bike at a weekend is a great thing to do.
Right.
Or even early morning before work. You can be out in countryside within about half an hour, 45 minutes of Shanghai, and it gives you a completely different perspective of what's going on. And it really kind of helps to clear the head.
Right. Cool. So final question, Liam. So many people come to China and it's kind of a bit discombobulating at first. You're kind of getting your footing, trying to understand how things work here. In relation to the work you've been doing over the past several years, what's the best piece of advice throughout your career, or since you've been here in China? What's the best piece of advice that you've received that you've felt was really inspiring, usable? Something that helped guide you through some of the perhaps the harder times, or helped overcome some obstacles that you might have encountered here.
I think you have to do something you're passionate about. I think day in, day out, if you're not doing something that you enjoy, that really motivates you, then it's not going to get you through. Right. If you find an area or perspective or an angle that's something that really does motivate you, then that's key to both personal success and I think also corporate success as well.
Absolutely, totally agree. So that's us at the end of the show. In terms of MobileNow, just to wrap up, where are you guys right now in terms of your status? What are you looking to the future for? Kind of any expansion plans, anything like that to speak of?
We've had a very busy very busy first start to the year, a lot busier than we anticipated. I think typically in China you do have a bit of a cyclical approach around Chinese New Year, where there's things to kind of tend to tail off for a little bit of time, which makes it I wouldn't say tricky, but something that business needs to bear in mind when they're planning.
Right.
But for us, we've had a very good quarter 1, quarter 2. We've been doing a lot more responsive and WeChat work. We had a big launch for Michael Kors for their Get Set experience down at Hongqiao a week or two ago. So we're really seeing a lot of momentum. We're obviously aiming for that to grow. As we see more and more projects come to the fore, we do expect to potentially grow our teams. Beijing would probably be a natural place to grow to. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there's a slightly different dynamic between Shanghai and Beijing from a corporate perspective and in terms of which entities are based there. But from a China expansion perspective, Beijing would probably be the most natural next step.
Cool. Well, Liam, thank you very much for coming on the show today. It's been a privilege to be able to speak to you and get some insight onto what your experience has been in China. And I hope our listeners have found it interesting. If they want to get in touch with you or MobileNow, is there somewhere where they can find you guys?
Absolutely. No, it's been very, very good to join today. Either check our website out in terms of mobilenowgroup.com. Then Liam at mobilenowgroup.com is my email address.
Cool. And if there's any people out there that are avid Chinese social media or other social media followers, do you guys have a presence on any of those platforms?
We have our own WeChat channel. We also have our own Weibo accounts. Plus, we also have the Western SNSs as well.
Right. So just Google MobileNow Group, and you'll find all the outlets.
They're all our outlets should be are accessible from our website too.
Cool. And you can find us, our dear listeners, at Tech in Shanghai. On Twitter, and of course up on iTunes, Tech in Shanghai. This is episode 2, and we hope there'll be plenty more to come. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Tech in Shanghai podcast. If you enjoyed the show, subscribe to us on iTunes and follow us on Twitter at Tech in Shanghai for everything tech from Shanghai and China. See you next time.